why would you use RNG at all? Especially if it's something that everyone generally disrespects, right? People can respect strategy. In fact, that's probably the most respected of the categories. And most people also respect the skill involved in shooters, for example, or platformers. Very few people respect the idea of a game of chance. But I'd like to sort of mount a defense of chance as a thing that you can use in other games or as part of your game system, but not necessarily purely as the leading force. So predictable determinism can be kind of hard. If you know the outcome at the start of the game, why would you play? You know, if two players who understand tic-tac-toe play against each other, you know it's going to be a draw. So what's the point? This is primarily a problem in single-player games, or if you have a multiplayer game between two very poorly matched players. You can overcome it by adding more complexity to game systems, but you'll still probably come up against a situation where you can predict the outcome, an individual situation within the game, even if you have a very complex game. Individual matchups within that game can still be fully deterministic and predictable. And maybe that's fine, but maybe you want to add a little bit of randomness just to add that bit of to put people on edge, to make sure that you can't immediately tell what's going to happen at the end of the compensation. The reason why I said it's primarily a concern in single-player games is because when you add another player into the mix, then you get the unpredictability of just the human brain being weird. Sometimes you have poor players who make stupid decisions. Sometimes you have extremely creative players who make ridiculously awesome decisions that nobody could ever predict. Secondly, I understand that realism is rarely a compelling argument in and of itself, but sometimes realism matters in a game. Sometimes you do want to give the player a feeling that, you know, the way the world works is roughly represented in the game. And when realism matters, randomness is usually crucial, because real life has too many variables for a person to overcome, for a person to process, in most situations. And if you add a measure of randomness, that can be used to simulate small factors outside of the player's control. So for example, if you fire a bow, or you shoot a bow, sorry, little gusts of wind, you probably don't want to simulate that in your game systems, but you can just add a little bit of randomness to simulate that. Sometimes weird things happen and the error goes a little bit out of time. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, randomness can moderate the type of skill demanded by the player. I'll get this slide now. So let's say you have a game of strategy. You could set up some continui to look at what kind of skill your game demands of the player. You could decide to set up one continuum between prediction and improvisation. So at one end, you have the ability to predict the future game state, and at the other end, you have the ability to adapt and improvise to unforeseen circumstances and surprises. And both of these are important parts of strategy as such. It's important that you can try to predict what the other player is going to do, or the AI or whatever, and what the game system is going to be, what state it's going to be in, and then design your strategy accordingly. But you also probably want to be able to adapt to surprises, because that's an important part of strategy in the real world. And it's also kind of what makes strategy games exciting and what makes them watchable for other players, for example. That's something to care about. So if you add randomness to a game, it's going to pull the game system in the direction of improvisation. Maybe that's not what you want. Maybe you want chess. I mean, chess is only unpredictable because of the human element, but otherwise it's a completely solved game. If you don't want your game to be a perfect information game, for example, adding randomness can pull it in the direction of improvisation, which means no matter how well or poorly matched the players are going to be, for example, that's always going to be a little bit of uncertainty. Similarly, if you have a game of Switch, again, I apologize for that word, you could set up a similar continuum where you have memory and reaction opposed to each other. So if a single-player shooter, for example, is fully determined, you could, in theory, replay each level until you remember exactly what's going to happen, where every enemy is going to pop out, where they're going to go, they're going to duck behind cover, pop out and shoot after exactly 4 seconds or something. And that way you could theoretically beat the level without ever improving your aim or your ability to pick out enemies against the background or any of the actual skills that you as a designer might want the player to actually use to overcome the game. I admit it's a contrived example because if you replay the level a lot, you have to be exceptionally dense to not also improve your aim and your pattern matching skills. But in theory, it could happen. And if you add randomness to, for example, enemy spawns, or a little bit of randomness to how accurate your weapons are and so on, randomize the movement of the enemies, their target priorities, anything like that, then the player has to actually improve the skills that you will want them to improve. And of course there's one more reason, and that is that sometimes life isn't fair, and maybe you want that to be represented in the game. Sometimes things just don't turn out the way you expected, and sometimes you're simply not in control. And if you are making a game that aims to convey a feeling of powerlessness or vulnerability or chaos or danger, then nothing beats randomness. It's an amazing way to make the player feel like they're not in control, because they're not. XCOM is a perfect example. XCOM is a game that rebels. I'm fucking you over. So in XCOM, you will miss 5 shots in a row, and now the enemies have the upper hand, right? Or your grenade misses the target and blows up your own cover, or you aggro 3 groups of enemies all at once and are massively overwhelmed by this huge amount of firepower. And clawing your way back from those situations can be incredibly satisfying, right? And also losing a game after a horrible streak of bad luck can be hilarious, which is why Dwarf Fortress exists, right? That's a game where the slogan is losing is fun. It makes for fun stories, at least. And they are situations where players will share stories about them, because you know your stories aren't going to be the same as what someone else experienced, because it's down to generating. Finally, obviously, I did mention that I wouldn't talk about generated content, but even without using randomness to generate content, you can still add a lot of replayability just by introducing randomness to your game systems. For example, many games have randomly occurring events that the player used to wander into. A lot of, especially open world games, use this a lot. And the unpredictability of when these events happen can change them a lot depending on the context. So if you run into a group of bandits at the beginning of the game when you're full health, all your party members are awesome morale, everyone's doing great, and you have maximum resources, then you're going to steamroll those guys and you feel great. But if you run into them maybe just after a fight, everyone is injured, you've spent all your resources, and you're just heading back to town to kind of rest and recuperate. Now you have to make a decision: do you fight or do you run? Maybe you try to claw your way through this bandit fight, and it completely changes how that event might feel. Which again can add a lot of replayability. Not to mention the fact that you're not sure when you completed the game that you've experienced everything, because there's that little randomness to when things happen. So you might want to try and replay it just to make sure that you've got all of the events. Okay, so I think that constitutes a reasonable defense of the idea of using randomness in games. So let's get to what I consider the meat of the talk. The problems you'll face. And I'm going to get the really obvious one out of the way first. Randomness will make QA more difficult. So it's hard enough to reproduce bugs without those bugs depending on some tiny prop chance, right? Prop means programmed random occurrence. So as a QA engineer or a tester, like the last thing you want is to read under how to reproduce one. In this random event that has a 0.05% chance of occurring each day on the campaign map, if the player has at least 1 injured follower and less than 20 medicine and has spoken to a specific character, if you choose to fight in that event, and the game chooses one specific character to be ambushed, and that character is brought down to 0 hit points or less with a critical hit, then the post-combat event text will assume they're alive. Good luck. And there's no real solution to this. The more randomness, the harder it will be to make sure the game is free of bugs. But there are some things you can do to mitigate it. And the simplest solution is, and the only one we really have time for, probably at a game jam at least, is to implement console commands so that you can change the probabilities of certain things happening, and so you can specifically trigger things that you need to test. If you have a very random game, you need to have something like that. A better and safer solution would be to use automated testing. It's a little much for Game Jam, but if you happen to be working on something like this in an actual, long-term project, then unit testing is really the only thing you can use to ensure, or at least approximately ensure, that you won't have a ton of bugs in random events or anything like that. You'll want to make sure that you have the right balance of randomness versus skill. So many of you may have played Dungeons and Dragons, and some of you may even have enjoyed it. Actually, D&D is kind of shit, but I won't get into the main reasons why. One of the problems with D&D is that the balance of the randomness is quite weird, I think. And this goes back to my previous point about randomness and strategy and switch-based games. So let's say, I'd like to say I haven't played D&D since 3.5, maybe it got better. I didn't much like things. Let's look at a level 3 character, for example. In 3.5, that means your max skill level is 6. It's pretty early in the game, but you're not fresh out of the tavern, so you would expect that your character would be semi. Your skill level is a direct result of your long-term decisions in the game, right? You decided how you wanted to set up your character. You decided that your rogue should be good at picking lots. So when you want to pick a lot, you roll a 1d20, which makes a 20-sided die, and that means you have a quarter of the outcome depends on your decisions, in this case, less than a quarter actually. Because your skill goes up to 6, but the randomness is from 1 to 20. So that means the range of the randomness is huge compared to what the part that you actually control. If we look at a level 15 character, it looks a little better, but still, you'll notice that you only control about half of the outcome of the situation, which is not, I don't know, maybe that's what they were going for, but I feel like that's weird. That's basically a game of chance. And 15 is a very high level character, basically epic. Maybe 50-50 is what you want. I was told 2 days ago actually that Richard Garfield has this 80-20 rule from Magic. I don't know why that's really fun. So that means that a good player should be a worse player 80% of the time, which is probably fine. It seems a bit much, but I guess it works for him. Magic isn't exactly an unpopular game. It's still a good chance that a better player will beat the worst player, but there's enough randomness in there that you can have a very unevenly matched fight, and it'll still be a little bit interesting to watch because there's a chance, right? The more randomness you add, the more randomness you add, the more level the playing field, but also the less strategy or skill will matter. Which again, maybe that's what you're going for. You know, if you're making a family game, adding more randomness is great because then the kids have a chance, right? If you're making a hardcore competitive game, you may want to rein it in a little bit, but you know, if it's almost purely a game of chance, then you're making Mario Kart, which is also a hugely successful and really good game that everyone likes playing, even though skill basically doesn't matter. So again, it's important to consider the balance of randomness versus skill when you're making a game. That's really the only thing I'm saying. You need to actually think about these things and decide how important should randomness be. You need to choose the right amount of randomness for your target audience and for your intended player experience. Also consider whether you're offering enough mechanics for the player to kind of overcome or compensate for the random number generator. If you have a game that isn't primarily a game of chance, then it should at least be possible to counteract the effects of randomness by using the mechanics well. And that's kind of just a question of how many mechanics do you have? How many ways can the player actually control the outcome of the situation? In this example, from Company Heroes 2, which is very good about giving you control over everything and not really making anything come down to chance. Still, we have a match-up here between 2 evenly matched tanks, and there's not much the player can do to influence the outcome of the situation. You can rotate the tanks, but their armor is best at the front. So at this point, both players have already rotated that tank correctly. Turret angling doesn't really matter, and maybe the nearest reinforcements are too far away to actually get them on time. In which case, it purely comes down to does RNG sustain? In a situation like this, in a game like this where you don't want randomness to be hugely important, you should also ensure that RNG never really occurs in non-interactive parts of the game. Another good example from Company Heroes 2, where when you spawn a certain unit, there's a random chance that you might get 1, 2, or I think also 0 light machine gunners, and that makes a huge impact on the combat effectiveness of that group. And there's no control over that at all as a player. You just roll the dice and hope the best. It probably isn't enough to determine the outcome of a fight because there's enough other mechanics in the game that you can compensate for bad luck if you're a good player. But it's worth keeping in mind when you introduce something like that. Ideally, if a situation in a strategy game or a Twitch-based game comes down to pure RNG, it should be the result of the player making poor decisions previously. You should be able to think back and go, damn it, if I had brought along one infantry unit to protect this tank, I wouldn't be in this situation. Something like that. Save scumming is a problem you will face when you introduce randomness. As you could have saves, which I guess is probably not necessary for Game Jam, but again, in general, if your game uses a lot of randomness, players will be tempted to load save games when things go really poorly for them, so that they can try again to get better numbers. Save scumming is really tedious, it is super boring, but players will still often feel compelled to do it, even though it's not interesting for them, if they know it works, right? You'll be tempted to do it even though it's painful, because you know it'll put you in a better situation going forward. One way you can mitigate this problem is to not give them control over when to save. You can use checkpoints, which raises the cost of save scumming, because now instead of just replaying the last 10 seconds, 30 seconds, maybe you have to go 5 minutes back, and you don't want to replay 5 minutes just on the chance that you might get better results. Text here. And yes. Secondly, you could also save the seed. This is the better solution in this case. So the first time you generate a random number, you use the first number in the sequence as the actual result, and then you save the second number. And then you use that as the seed for the next time you want a random number. If you have save games, make sure that you also save the seeds. And ideally, save different seeds for different types of numbers. So if you have an RPG or strategy game, save one for hit chance, and a different seed for damage, and a different seed for crit chance, and so on. So the player can't just load and then spend their bad luck on something that doesn't matter as much. They still can to some extent, but it won't be as easy. Basically, what you're ensuring when you save the seed is just that the player's overall luck will be the same if they really luck. They may be able to use their bad luck better, but in a way that's kind of cool. Still, if you accept save scumming. Alright. I've saved my most interesting points here. Like you're supposed to. So as the lead designer of Logic Artist, I am the person who's ultimately responsible for the player experience. And that means I have to keep in mind how every design decision impacts the player's feelings about the game. And there is very little in an RPG or strategy game that impacts your feelings about the game as much as randomness. Any game where the player can be expected to learn the rules, system design in general will have a big impact on the player experience, and randomness is a big part of system design, and randomness is very dangerous if you expose it to the player. Basically, humans suck at probabilities. Probabilities are incredibly unintuitive. We are really good at finding patterns. We're also really good at finding patterns where there are no patterns. We're really good at analyzing causality. A happens, therefore B. We're not particularly good at understanding that sometimes B just happens. So I'd like to use this example that many of you will probably be familiar with. I'm sorry if this is going to be a little boring for you, but let's say you have a game show, which is a game show that actually exists at this point. You have 3 doors. Behind one door is the budget to develop your next game project. The CEO of Paradox is standing there with a huge wall of cash. You have to pick a door. You don't know where he is. You pick C. At this point, there is a 33% chance that you pick the correct door. And then the host removes door B and says, okay, well, I can tell you he wasn't behind door B. Would you like to change your decision? And most people will intuitively say, nah, it doesn't matter. I can change it, I can keep it, it's the same. There's a 33% chance that he's behind the door I picked, that he's behind the other door. Reality hasn't changed just because there's but the correct answer is to change it every time. But there's actually a 66% chance that he's behind door A. And the best way to understand this is to imagine the best doors instead. And you pick the 66. And then the host removes 98 doors, leaving 66 and 18. Obviously, you're going to change your decision because there was a very small chance that you actually made the right decision. And that's just an example of how, depending on the situation and depending on the numbers involved as well, it can be incredibly confusing and unintuitive to deal with probabilities. And of course, you can work through the math, but most players aren't going to be doing it. Some players are, though. So what does this mean specifically in game design? So if you take a game like Expedition Conquistador, Game of the Year 2013, whenever you make a ranged attack, the game shows you the percentage chance that you'll hit. I'm pretty sure this is a certain code, but I didn't check. But if you don't cheat in the player's favor, they will think you're cheating against them. That's the basic rule. That's definitely something I learned with Conquistador. So let's say that you make a ranged attack in Conquistador. Everyone on the forums and everyone in the reviews are certain that the game is lying to them about hit chances. It's one of the main complaints. The game's clearly cheating because you missed on an 80% shot, so that's suspicious. Right? You should be hitting 90%. But if you miss twice in a row on an 80% chance, then that is obvious bullshit, right? That's definitely cheating. That should never happen. But it's a 40-hour game. You're going to be making a lot of attacks, and every 25th time that you make two 80% shots in a row, you will miss both of them. That's how probabilities work. I have math for it to prove it. Math. So it doesn't even matter if you hit on like a 50% shot in the middle of the two 80% shots. You won't remember that because it's not really part of the pattern. What you're remembering is that the last time you tried that 80% chance, you also missed. So it's clearly cheating. So Sid Meier said you have to cheat in the player's favor. And I have two suggestions for how you should do that. Bear in mind, this is only really relevant if you're making a game where you're showing the player the hit probabilities or the chances, or if you're making a game where they care enough that they're going to decompile your code and find problems. Fortunately, nobody cares that much about Conquistador. Right. So, in this slide, which I should credit to my good friend Nick, who was a Telltale, he crunched some numbers to figure out what the hell XCOM was doing. This is what XCOM is doing, roughly. So this is the first solution, weighted probabilities. Weighted probabilities can be used to smooth the extreme ends of the probability curve. So what you see here is that the red curve is just a straight up random number. He simulated it 100,000 times, and these are the numbers that he got. Pretty uniform distribution. If it says that you have a 20% chance of hitting, you have a 20% chance of hitting. But then in the green one, we make two random numbers, we add them up, and then we divide by 2. So it's the average between two random numbers. And what you'll see is that it's way smoother on the ends. But something that appears to be unlikely will really, really be unlikely. And vice versa. Around the middle, it's still 50. If the game tells you you have a 50% hit chance, you have a 50% hit chance. But if the game tells you you have a 20% hit chance, it's actually more like 8. So it's lying to you. But ironically, you will think, great, the game's being super honest with me. This makes so much sense. It's actually going to match pretty well with what you expect as a player. The blue one is the one we use in Viking, which is my preferred one. What we do is we take one number, one random number, and then we multiply it by 3. Then we add up a second random number, and then we divide the whole thing by 4. So we are using a weighted probability curve, basically, where the first number will count much more, making it a little more random than the green curve, but still nicer at the end. And this is because two random numbers, like a series of random numbers, will kind of form a nice bell curve, right? It works because, I'm going to read from my notes here. The average random floating point number between 0.0 and 1.0 is convergent on 0.5. So the more random numbers you get, the more of them you'll get around this area, similar to how when you roll 2 dice, most of your numbers will be somewhere in the middle because there's more combinations of numbers from 1 to 6 that will form numbers in the middle. So if you look at the blue curve, it doesn't drop as sharply over the middle. With the green one, if we're looking at 55, we're actually getting 60%. with the blue one, we're getting 57-ish. So it's more sort of honest over the middle, but once we get to the ends, it's still basically lying to you. If it tells you you have an 80% chance to hit, what you actually have is a 90% chance. And that will correspond better with what players expect. We're basically making likely things likelier and unlikely things more unlikely. So this is great for turn-based games, because the players will be looking at each individual probability and factoring that into their strategy, their tactics. They'll be banking on whether or not they will hit. And they'll essentially, you can expect them to kind of chunk the full range into 5 or so series where, if it's 40 to 60, that's a crapshoot, right? You can't really count on that, but you can take the shot. If it's 60 to 80, that's a good chance. You'll probably pass that as around 3/4 chance of hitting. And if it's 80 or above, that's a sure thing. That's definitely going to hit. And the same thing goes for the other side. In a real-time game, though, you probably don't want to do this, because the players won't really be looking at individual probabilities. They'll be perceiving what goes on over time. So in Dota 2, for example, when you're making a bunch of attacks and you've been told that each of your attacks have a 25% chance of proccing a specific effect, you will expect that you'll get it roughly every 3rd to 5th time you make that attack. And that's really all you're looking at. You're not going to be super angry if your first attack with an 80% hit chance doesn't actually proc the effect, because you're not thinking about it that way. So that leads us to solution 2, which I have actually stolen from Dota. Pseudo-random distribution. The formula looks like this. So Pn is the probability that your random effect will occur on the n number attack. C is your probability, your constant, and n is the number of your attacks. So I will use a nice slightly different, whatever. Pillar diagram? No. Okay, so what we see here is that, think about it like this. Every time you make an attack, if it didn't proc the effect, we add the constant to itself. So then the probability goes up on the next attack. This means that Dota 2 has a specific effect where it tells you it's 25% chance that it'll happen, but it's actually 8.5. This is the big difference. So the first time you use that attack, it will have an 8.5% chance of actually proccing the effect. The second time it will be 17% if you didn't proc it the first time. So here the idea is that this blue bar is the probability of the effect occurring not on the first, but on the second. As soon as the effect occurs, we reset and we start over. So this is just looking at one series. What is the probability that it happens on the first attack, the second attack, the third attack, and so on? And the reason why the red one goes down is that because the probability of the attack having already occurred is higher and higher and higher, right? The probability that it takes us 14 attempts to get a 25% chance is pretty low, but it's there. There's a good chance that it might take us 8 or 9 attacks to get that effect, and it's disproportionately more likely to happen on the first attack. Whereas with the blue one, it's a little more even. Over time, we'll find that it's spread out much better than on the uniform distribution. It's much less likely that you'll get the effect twice in a row, and it's much less likely that you'll have to wait really long to get the effect. It'll generally even out to about 25%. So what the game tells you is actually, it will even out to 25%, but each individual attack does not actually have a 25% chance of proccing it. I can send you this. You don't have to take screenshots of it in case you want it. I think this is really cool, but then I work with this kind of stuff. All right, that's actually pretty good. I think we're on time. So I'll just summarize everything that I've said. First off, consider what randomness can do for you. What kind of game are you making? What's your target audience? How much randomness do you want? Randomness is usually important. Consider how it's balanced against player skill in your game systems, and tweak the numbers to fit your game, or add more mechanics to counteract the RNG. Or if you want it to be more random, take more mechanics out so that the RNG becomes more important, or add the randomness to those mechanics as well, or whatever suits you better. But those are the two things you can do to kind of balance the randomness in your game systems. You need to give yourselves or your testers ways to neutralize RNG during testing, because otherwise you will die. you will just be buried under bug reports. And you'll think your game is super bug-free, and then a million players will play it, if you're really lucky. And you will also get 10 million bug reports. People can't handle randomness. They think they want the truth, but they don't. Because it's unintuitive, that's the main thing. It's not really even about the truth or not. It's about what you can be expected to understand as a player. You can't be expected to do the probability math on every single attack. Just give them a number that they can actually understand intuitively, even though it's not correct at all. And that's about it. You can write me if you want the slides for some reason. And if you have any questions, I think we have 5 to 10 minutes left. Assistant left, so I have no idea. Oh, okay, cool. Yeah?
Yeah, it was just a question for the Dota one. If you know that the attack changes depending on how many attacks you make, if it saves that attack possibility, wouldn't it work for a more, what do you call, experienced player to actually attack a certain amount of time to increase his chances and then do the attack?
You can totally do that. You could totally farm what are they called? I don't play Dota. Trash mobs, don't, the little AI control dudes. You could be attacking those to try and bring the probability of infect up, and then stop, and then go and hit a player, and there would be a really high chance that you would get them. If you attack twice, there's a high chance you'll get them on the third or fourth attack. In practice, that's pretty difficult. And it's not really something you can count on, right? You'll probably be getting it a bunch on the first and second time, like, and then you have to start over, and you have to keep count of it, and still you might not get it until 7, so you could do it, but it's hard. Also, it's important to note that Dota 2 only increases the probability if there was a chance that your attack would have the effect. So if you're attacking buildings or something which aren't susceptible to the effect, that does nothing. That doesn't change the problem. So
I didn't really get the D&D part. Can you please try to explain it again?
Oh God.
Or in some other way?
It's really just an example of how important it is to balance randomness against strategy or player skill. When you make a skill check with a low-level character in D&D, you have very little control over the outcome, that's all I'm saying, because you can't do much. There are bonuses that you can get if you convince your DM that your plan is particularly smart, and obviously the DM changes the probabilities by setting the challenge level, or whatever it's called. Wow, okay, it's been too long since I played D&D. But because the range of the randomness is huge compared to the number you actually have control over, look at a game like Expeditions Conquistador. If you look at randomness there, each damage has a range from 1 to 10. Each attack has a damage range from 1 to 10 on top of your actual damage. But your actual damage goes from usually around 20, meaning at the very lowest level, you still control 2/3 of the outcome, to 60, 70, at which point that 10% randomness doesn't matter all that much anymore. So it's just about picking a random range that is proportional to the part of the role or the outcome that the player actually has control over. Does that make sense?
Somewhat.
If you were using a 1d6 instead of a 1d20, it would be much better. Then at the low level, you would control 50% of the outcome.
So basically, the tighter the chances are, the less random it is.
Yeah, it basically means if it's 1d20 and you have a 6 skill point number, then the randomness is 7 to 26, which is huge. Whereas if you roll 1d6, that would be like 7 to 12, which is not.
I think I get it.
Yeah.
Earlier on the slides, you presented the types of game that you consider chance. There was a slide of a game called Peckle. And I was thinking that like, how do you define randomness as a term? Mostly in that, I'm thinking that it's a dice roll and something you ask the computer to do, generate a random number. But Peckle, I would see as a physics-based game, because you could potentially calculate where it would end up going, but because it's so hard, you still call it randomness, or how does that correlate?
Yeah, I suppose it ties into what I said about dice as well. Dice aren't random. They use physics, but you can't predict what's going to happen because it's too complicated. Obviously, a lot of the time you can't predict what's going to happen in Peckle. especially if you only have one peg left. You know you're gonna hit it from this side, it's probably gonna bounce off in this direction. I'm not really sure how accurate or predictable the physics model in Peggle is. I do remember reading that it is pretty random. It's not that physicsy and more sort of, hey, let's pick a random vector in this rough range. So it's, yeah, and you could make a case that it's actually also a little bit of a game of skill, but I would say the randomness vastly outweighs the skill in most situations. I don't know if, yeah?
On that slide, what game is that on the other way home?
I don't know. It's a JRPG, that's all I know. I googled games of chance because I could legitimately only think of Pickle and like craps, right? I couldn't think of anything else. And then I got some other lottery game, and this, I don't know what that is. It looks pretty random to me. It's surprisingly difficult to come up with actual games of pure chance just because nobody really wants to play games of chance except if money is involved. And then it's a whole other thing.
It's like Costco.
What?
Like Costco.
Yeah. I was so close to adding Hearthstone to this. And also so many of the pictures that come up if you Google RNGesus involve Hearthstone. They are super butthurt about how much randomness is. Yeah.
It was just in regards to XCOM, because the latest XCOM has made the seed saving thing to prevent save scumming. It doesn't really work though, because you just need to move your figures a little to change the seed, and then you can save scum all you want.
Right.
But in regards to the save scumming thing, isn't it again the conflict with the players feeling cheated? Because if they reload, they expect a different result because they feel that in a game of luck and chance, they should change every time you try it again.
Yeah, maybe. I guess that's why they made it an option in XCOM. We're a little more dickish. We don't give you the option. We definitely don't want you to save scum. But I mean, yeah, you could make a case that save scumming should be allowed.
Because I feel more that the save scumming should be prevented, for instance, in a competitive environment or anything where you don't want the player to be able to change by kind of cheat.
Sure. I mean, again, I think it's a question of, is it fun? Like, is it engaging? Is it cool to be able to load a save game from 20 minutes back and you have to play through all of that again? I don't think it's particularly engaging. But yeah, I mean, you could make a case that it should be allowed anyway. Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, you're only cheating yourself in a single-player game when it comes down to it.
You mentioned your dislike for the RG system in D&D. I was wondering,
Never done that.
in, for example, a video game where character progression heightens the chance, for example, a hit chance if your character trains in an instance and they might have an 80% chance of hitting compared to the start of the game, they have a 20% chance. How is that different than actually rolling a dice in D&D? If I give you an example that, for example, the game master says that you have to roll a d20 and you have to roll above 10 or 10 or above, and you have no skill in this, that means 50% chance. But if you have 2 points in the skill, that means it is 60% chance.
Yeah.
How is that different than an actual video game that says you've trained this skill so now it's easier?
Yeah, I mean, the obvious difference is that it's actually better in D&D in this case because the dungeon master can control how much randomness should be there by setting the challenge. So in that respect, D&D is actually better when you compare it to a video game that would use similar or even the same system. I don't know. I mean, changing the percentage chance itself is a whole other set of problems, and it can work. We do it in Viking as well, but yeah, I don't know.
You mentioned how you dislike how that system works because it's too random, there's not much player control, but then I'm wondering, what is the difference between how a video game does it? I mean, isn't there the same amount of control?
Well, it's not so much, no, it's not about the idea of there being randomness, it's just about what the range is. That's my main complaint. And like, it's tongue-in-cheek because obviously, I'm sure D&D thought about how much randomness should be involved and they decided this was the accurate amount for their game. And again, the dungeon master can just set a lower challenge, and then the probabilities change. Yeah, it's not. I don't have anything against randomness as part of skill checks, for example. It's more about how much randomness compared to how much the player's choices matter. That was the point I was trying to make. I don't hate D&D. There are better systems. Actually, if you want to hate D&D, you should watch Josh Sawyer's talk. He has some great points why D&D sucks. And I will put up his face. No, that hands that well. It's a really good talk. You should definitely watch it. I think we still have time for some questions, but otherwise, yeah, feel free to. Oh, sorry.
How do you handle RNG in level generation?
In
Level generation, like random levels, and have to.
specifically in our games.
Yeah. How would you handle RNG? Would you make it pure random?
No, that's generated content, and then you need to talk to a programmer. I don't know really. I mean, we do use randomness for random events, which load up different scenes. Like you'll meet someone on the campaign map, and you can choose to fight them, and then it loads up an area, and you can. Yeah, but the area itself is not generated, so I have no experience in that regard. I would say no, you probably don't make it random. I can't imagine any game that would generate levels completely randomly, because that's going to be weird. I mean, obviously Minecraft has, for example, super complicated algorithms that give you a landscape that looks right. So.
Can Monkey do that? So every time you load up on like a mine type of game, you'll like load a random map.
Yeah.
So that every time you do it, it's like a different level.
But they also have complicated algorithms, or at least they have clever ways of assembling a level that can actually be completed, because you don't want to you want to make sure that the level has walls around it, that it has a player start and an exit, and that there are no drops where you have to fall to your death. That would suck. So they need all of these extra algorithms and checks and rules just to make sure that the game is playable. It's not fully random, but yes, it is definitely randomized, and it's different every time. Again, generated content is not my area of expertise. Yeah?
Games that incorporate drop chance of items that you may pick up, for example, World of Warcraft, are there any general approaches that create a better play experience? So sometimes you have very unique items that you want to drop too often, but in many cases you also want to implement randomness with something that should drop often, but you just get random case that it doesn't. Is there any specific approach to make the experience better for play?
I mean, other than just making sure that you have a bunch of numbers that all influence the drop rate, like you'll have how rare should this item be to begin with, and then probably the higher level enemy you kill, the more probability. I would say it's not enough to have one number to govern that. You probably need a whole set of numbers to control in that sense. Other than that, I would say that the second, the Dota 2 way of faking probability would probably be pretty good for something like that, because you're not getting loot from one enemy at a time usually. You're getting a whole group of enemies, and then they all do loot drop chance at the same time. So to ensure a good sort of even distribution of loot from them, it would probably be a good idea to do something like that Dota 2 does. Okay, let's call it a day. You have games.